The southeasterly slopes, I think we're up to about 70, 75 centimeters of accumulation in total. So most certainly not normal.
Welcome to Kelowna Talks, where we explore the why behind the decisions that shape your city. Together, we open the curtain and dig deep into current issues, plans, and policies that come out of City Hall. Thanks for joining us as we talk about Kelowna and the topics that matter to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bob Evans, Partnership Director at the City of Kelowna and host of our Kelowna Talks podcast. I acknowledge that our community is located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. So, in early December, we delayed the opening of our outdoor rink, Stewart Park, because it was too warm. And then mid-December, it started snowing, and snowing, and snowing again. For several weeks, it seemed the snow just kept on coming. And then we started hearing from our citizens, where are the snow removal trucks? I can't get out of my cul-de-sac. Well, today we're chatting with Gert Bos, our Public Works Manager, to talk about all that snow. Welcome, Gert.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. You're relatively new to the city. Is that right? Is this your first winter in Kelowna?
It is indeed my first winter, and it came with a bang.
Well, we'd like to put people in their jobs and put the pressure on them right away.
Get it out of the way.
Yeah.
Understood.
And where'd you move from?
We moved up from the coast last year, so we just spent our first year here. We moved up in October, and last year we got surprised by the October 17th event of snowfall, right? So, we've been here a year. We're really liking the Okanagan lifestyle. We're taken to it rather rapidly. I mean, I've gotten used to my 20-minute commute very, very, very quickly, we love being here.
Yeah, it's pretty nice, isn't it? I moved here
is.
from Toronto, 29 years ago, and the first commute we did, it's like, oh, we have all this extra time. Now what do we do? And there's a lot of opportunities in Kelowna to do extra things. So what do you like to do when you're not shoveling snow for the city?
When I'm not shoveling snow, I'm typically I can be found out on the lake. I'm still very into spending as much time as we can actually on the water and then exploring the lake and just getting around town. Like you said, it's a new town for us, and we still it kind of like got the exploring bug going in us once again. I mean, we're new to town. We like to explore the area, so we like to go for hikes and walks, etc. with the dogs, and it's great to find all these new little hidden gems.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? And before you moved to Kelowna and worked for the City of Kelowna, who did you work for when you were in the Lower Mainland?
I was in the Lower Mainland. I worked for the Vancouver Airport Authority for the last 10 years. And then, of course, COVID hit. And I think that gave the aviation industry a big knock to the system. I mean, I remember March of 2020 where we went down to 3% of previous traffic, right? And we saw it here in Kelowna as well. And that's just kind of is a bit of a wake-up call to the system, I think, and a wake-up call to many of us. And we kind of looked at it as an opportunity and said, well, maybe, it's time for a change. And here we are.
Well, we're happy to have you.
Thank you.
So, obviously we can't control the weather, and it seems like the weather has been top of the news cycle in Kelowna and around British Columbia for the past 9 months. As we know, waves of fire, flood, snow. What has this meant for your particular group with these extreme weather events? And has it been an unusual year for you in terms of work, or do these events just part of how you plan your normal year?
Well, even if you go back to the summer was even an event for us where normally we would have crews out during the day and doing some paving work. But if you have the paving equipment out when it's 46 degrees outside, it's really becoming an environment that is quite hostile to work in. So we had to start making adjustments at the end of June already to kind of the way we deliver our services to the community, right? So when we started looking at snow and started kind of hearing that the El Nino year was still in kind of full swing, so a potential for a lot more accumulation than we normally see in the typical Okanagan winter, we kind of started getting really early to make sure that all the equipment was ready, that we had the folks on the various shifts so that we could provide a sustained 24-hour coverage. So it's been a long planning exercise to get ready for this winter. And for a little while there, early December, as you said, December the 2nd, we hit 17.9 degrees. It didn't look like it was going to go very much, but before you know it, we were at minus 27 and it was snowing. And the southeasterly slopes, I think we're up to about 70, 75 centimeters of accumulation in total. So most certainly not normal.
Yeah, the weather likes to suck us into lethargy, I guess. And all of a sudden, then you turn around the next day and it's like, wham,
That's
here we
right.
are.
That's
yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump to mid-December. And as you just started talking about it, what was happening in terms of weather alerts? In other words, do we get our heads up about the amount of snow that was coming? So it sounds like from your previous comments that you're tracking weather patterns and you're preparing yourself and your crews for these major events.
We do. So we have various forecasting services at our disposal, and we kind of like look at I have to say the Central Valley is not an easy one to predict the weather, right? And so we work with local forecasters, but we also have a forecasting agency in Seattle that kind of like helps us with the interpretation for the medium term. And I'm saying really only 2 to 3 days out. That's really the best we can do.
So we actually have like a consulting arrangement with these forecasters?
Yeah, we have, it's called WeatherNet US, and they basically give us all the info. And when we require a little bit more clarity into what we're seeing, we're not afraid to reach out to Environment Canada, Mr. Lindquist, for example, or some of the local forecasters that have some of that local know-how that is ever so important for this particular area.
So you're not just standing in the middle of a field and sucking your finger and seeing if the water dries off your finger.
Yeah, no, we tried that once and it didn't go over very well.
Very well. Okay, good. I'm trying to bring humor into this topic of snow, and I think it's been on everybody's mind in this particular winter. So tell us a little bit more of what's involved in getting rid of snow. We have a policy apparently at the city, and so is there a method to the madness?
There is indeed a method to the madness, and it is indeed guided by the council policies. So we have a priority system where we are providing a level of service where, for example, the major arterials within 8 hours of a snow event ending, that those need to be passable by a vehicle. And I say passable rather than down to bare pavement, because sometimes that's not an option or not the best option, right? So then we go on to the priority 2 routes when that's completed, and so on until we hit the priority 3s, which need to be completed in a 48-hour time span. Now, as you know, the biggest challenge that we had many events in rapid succession, and what happens is when the snow event ends, and we'll say we're in hour 24 and we're making our ways towards the cul-de-sacs, etc., it starts snowing again, and our basically priority system gets reset, and all the folks go back to the priority 1 routes. So if you live in a cul-de-sac, we've had folks saying, hey, you know what, it's been 4 or 5 days and I haven't seen the snowplow.
So the events just pile up and you have to go to priority 1 road.
We have to go back, yes.
You were almost at the cul-de-sac and then it snowed and you have to go back to priority 1.
And especially since December the 24th, there was 13 days of that in strong succession, right? So very tough to keep up with.
Well, I'm a skier. I love the snow. I wouldn't say I love shoveling, and I bought a couple of machines this year to help me out a little bit on that because it gets to be an issue. But how do you, where does the snow go? So I noticed this year downtown we had rows of snow in the middle of the street, and that's probably the first year I can remember in my 29 years in Kelowna that I've seen that. Obviously, you can't haul it all away. So what do you normally do with it?
Yeah, so, I mean, I like to say, operations is where the rubber meets the road, right? And it's also kind of like we're the guardians of the triple bottom line, if you will. So we can throw a whole bunch of money at it, and we can throw a whole bunch of people at it, and we can do that for a sustained amount of time. But we got to kind of take a balanced approach, right? So if you look at the way the city has been designed, it's kind of been designed to deal with about 40 to 45 centimeters of consecutive accumulation. So that basically means that we can have 40 centimeters on the ground, and it doesn't really mean that we need to get rid of it. However, once we start getting past that 45 centimeter mark, in certain areas, especially the more dense areas, we have to get rid of the snow. And that comes with not only a price tag, but there is also an emissions conversation to be had about, hey, listen, besides it costing a lot of money, for example, when we were downtown, that whole exercise cost us about $150,000, right? So you'll still see certain areas where we've left the snow because that's the decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. What's the value add in removing that snow versus the impact it has broadly, right? So we kind of weigh those pros and cons on an ongoing basis and say, you know what, this is good enough for now, knowing what we know about the weather that's coming. So, for example, we saw this thaw cycle coming. So we say, you know what, we get rid of most of it, and the rest we'll let subside to natural thaw, for example, right? So it's it's a difficult call to make because it's a lot of money, right? And we just have to be very careful with the resources that we do have and make sure that we get the best bang for the buck.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to ask you about the snow removal budget, but I'm going to start with, you mentioned the resources. Tell us a little bit about your department, how many people you have working under your authority? How does that look?
So normally in roadways we have about 50 folks in both construction and operations working around the summer. But in the winter what you'll see is you'll start seeing a migration where our department gets augmented with folks from parks, for example. We had a whole bunch of people coming in. Utilities. So these are basically some of the activities that we normally don't undertake in the winter, and we kind of like absorb that labor into our labor force for snow removal. And this year, at any given time, we had about up to 75 folks, so 25 people from other departments helping us out with day-to-day snow removal, right? And that's how we can provide the sustained service because it started snowing on December the 24th, and we were in cleanup mode well until January the 13th, right? So that's a long, long period of time, and it's those 75 people and those augmentations that allow us to kind of like play with how we can make sure that we can keep doing this for a sustained period of time.
So these people are not out there with shovels. So do we have our own equipment, or we lease equipment?
No, so we have
a big fleet.
We have 35 pieces of equipment that are slated for snow removal that get converted to snow removal, actually. And then we also have access to the various units from the local contracting community. So, for example, we have 6 tandems on contract, which we used, for example, on Christmas Day. So some of the folks could take a couple-hour break and spend some time with the family, either opening presents or having some dinner. And then we also have access to some crews that help us out with the clearing of the cul-de-sac. So right now there's still, I think, 6 teams out there of contractors removing snow from cul-de-sacs. So we have a very balanced setup. So we have some flexing capacity, which is really nice to have.
No, absolutely. And as you were talking, I was thinking to myself about some of the controversial issues that I've heard around snow removal. And we've been talking about roads. As you know, we're pretty focused on active transportation in the city of Kelowna, so therefore bike lanes, sidewalks, and we're trying to encourage that type of alternative transportation. So can you help me understand, help all the listeners understand how active transportation corridors, sidewalks, and so on fit into your management strategy?
Yeah, so the active transportation corridors are kind of like set on its own. They have their own service levels. So if you look at the rail trail, for example, we have an event, we have a contractor that clears that within 24 hours, and you can see it. I mean, it's in good condition for most of the winter. Where we run into some issues is, for example, certain areas on Ethel Street. We have a beautiful bike lane there, but the minute we get more than like 10 centimeters of accumulation, we run into the social dilemmas like, listen, we got to remove the snow from this particular bike lane to restore its service. However, that comes with a price tag. For example, in Ethel, to remove it every single time, we would have to burn about 300 liters of diesel fuel, which equates about 1,700 trips of 1,700 kilometers of cycling that needs to be offset, right? So if we know that it's going to snow again within 3 days and we have to fill up that bike lane again to get ready for the snow of the roadway so that then we can come in and remove the snow, it's like, is that really a good use of resources? A, money, but then B, it's like, are we indeed going to see those offset requirements happening in that short amount of time? And then sometimes we do have to make the unpopular decision to say, listen, the Ethel bike lane is closed because it's not a viable alternative right now, right? So, and we don't make those decisions lightly. We weigh those because we know there's an impact and an expectation. But sometimes we have to make those hard decisions, and it's like, hey, you know what? That's a lot of emissions for 2.2 kilometers of bicycle lane that sees a pretty light usage in heavy events. It's like not the popular decision sometimes, but most certainly the right decision to make.
Well, it's great because I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm thinking, wow, the whole public works snow removal approach in business is so different than it was a couple of decades ago, and just the fact that you're aware of carbon offsets and the relative costs, both environmentally and financially, is it's great to hear.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah. And we only have finite resources, right? And it's not just the money and the people, but the environment most certainly plays in that, right? So when we have our discussions, for example, when we start talking about bicycle lane designs and all that kind of stuff, we try to make sure it's like, hey, listen, there are going to be events where we're going to see these snow accumulations. What are we going to do with the snow? And do we have options, or can we come up with a winter cycling strategy where we can exist without the Ethel bike corridor, for example, for 3 months? And kind of like reroute some of the traffic to the more maintainable sections of it, right? So it's kind of like we got to weigh the pros and cons for each of these kind of like scenarios.
Okay, so have a vision.
Yes.
how do we approach the budget? What is our budget numbers? Is that a flexible thing? Do you have to go back to the coffer sometime to get more money? Do we just deal with it and then account for it at the end? What's your approach to your yearly budget?
Yeah, so we try to manage the best we can. So we kind of like the guiding principle here is the service levels, right? So the service levels dictate that we shall remove the snow within X hours of the event, right? So, however, with those blanket statements also comes a little bit of flexibility, right? So, for example, if we have the P1s and the P2s done and it's Sunday afternoon and everybody's in on overtime, you will see that we sometimes will make the decision to say, hey, you know what, we're going to send everybody home and we will start again on Monday morning, because that allows us to start clearing the cul-de-sac, still meet the service level without having to spend an extra lot of money on labor, for example, and it will allow us to kind of like flex our resources a little bit. So we keep tabs on where the money goes on a continuing basis during the events, and that's not easy, but it's most certainly for the taxpayers and for the city, it's the right thing to do, and that's what we focus on. So when we see budget overruns, it's typically, so we've managed according to the events, and those shortfalls typically get made up by the reserves that we have for snow removal, but we try and minimize the overruns to the best way we can. Like, so for example, you'll see a snow removal where we physically truck the snow out. Those are, we know, very expensive exercises, and we'll make those like, you know what, there is really no other way than dealing with this than doing snow removal. Then we will make that decision. But had we had 35 centimeters, we would have said, you know what, we'll focus on some clearing and some moving of snow around downtown, but we're going to refrain from removing the snow because it allows a little bit more flexibility in the budget. This time around, we didn't have that luxury.
Right. And of course, we have a variety of years and cycles and so on, so you're amortizing out your expenses.
We try to, yes.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so now we look out the window here on our 16th floor, and the snow's melting. And now what happens to all that snow? Goes into the storm sewers. Are we going to have issues with flooding in our systems when we have this, huge snow accumulation this year in the city, or what? How do we deal with that?
So potentially, I mean, there's always lots of snow and freezing temperatures, and then an aggressive thaw potentially can have some issues, right? But like we said, we have a pretty good handle on what happens with the forecast. For example, the city is equipped with 12,000 catch basins, and our utility folks know exactly where these catch basins are. So when we start going into the snow melting cycle, you'll see a whole bunch of teams going out and actually start punching holes in the windrows along the side so that we can open up the catch basins. We reach out to the citizens and say, hey, you know what, you can help by opening up the catch basins. And it's been pretty good this year because we didn't see an accelerated melt, right? We only saw maybe 3-5 degrees, not very many sunny days in the beginning, which is good because it gives us a sustained slow temperature melt, and it gives a runoff that we can manage, right? If you get plus 10 degrees and straight sunshine, oof, different story, right? So again, we manage according to what the weather forecast kind of like tells us to do, right?
Okay, I have a few more questions, but when I'm sitting here listening to you talk and looking at your facial expressions, which of course nobody else can see, it's like, this guy's into this stuff. Like, he likes it, he loves it, he's passionate about it. How do you get to that spot, Gert? Like, where did you come from? What was your, when we had Sam Samador on, I asked him if he played with little airplanes as a kid, but he got his pilot's license and he was into airports. So how did you get into your passion around public works?
You know what? I started out, funny enough, as a marine engineer, and I quit sailing in the late 90s as a result of a very bad accident that kind of like made me take stock. And I've since then been involved in operations. I've been in operations in the food industry, aviation industry, and I just love operations because operations, the art of operations is really putting a whole bunch of moving parts and putting that all together and kind of like taking a step back and making it all sing like what I call the snow removal, like a ballet de déneigement, right? So it's the dance of the snow removal. And I think in operations, it is a dance. You
heard it here first, folks.
There you go.
The
right?
dance of the snow angel.
The dance of the snow removal. And it's a passionate thing. And I think The nice thing about operations is like every little thing we do matters, and you can see the difference, right? So everything we do with our team members, everything we do with the budget, all these little things just kind of like gives you an opportunity to make it sing, right? And if you can't hear it, that's okay. That's why we got engineers, and that's why we got maintenance folks, and operational people really like that little, they like to hear the budget sing, they like to hear the team sing. Our like team performance is a big one for me. It's making sure that the team is well equipped, that it's well taken care of, because in the end, without the folks in the seats, there's really not much of an operation, right? It's those folks that bring man and machine together, and it's just a thing of beauty. It just makes me excited.
Well, that's good, Gert. That's a great story. I love to hear it. So as we look to the future, are these... There's a lot in the press. Are these major storm events, weather events, the new normal? What's your reading, your training, the information that you receive, and how are you incorporating that into your day-to-day or yearly planning processes?
Yeah, I think there's a natural apprehension in all of us to say, oh yeah, maybe this is the new normal, or maybe it's not. I don't know, but it's like what we see if you go back on the historical data. Is it what we see now? So 2 strong La Niñas in a row, is that unheard of? It's rare, but it's not unheard of, right? So if we now start looking at what some of the climate scientists are saying, that the winters are going to be wetter, they're going to be seeing more events, I think we might just kind of like move in that direction that, you know what, the winters as we know them in the valley here might not be as calm as that they used to be, right? So we see the events, we might see some more big events coming in February, and that might just be the new normal. So we most certainly will keep an eye on it. We'll keep an eye on the stats, and once we start seeing the changes in some of the historical data, then it's most certainly a time to look forward and say, okay, what do we need to do? Is there any differences in approach to snow removal and or plowing and or winter maintenance, budgetary questions? Those are all things that we just got to keep in mind and kind of like refresh. And as the summer comes along, we'll probably get a pretty good indication as to what the winter is going to look like, fortunately, right? So it's kind of like there's some telltales in there. So we'll stay on top of it.
Okay, lots of events, lots of negative talk. Well, actually negative talk, but just how we deal with some of these impactful weather events in our city. And we're coming towards the end of our time here, and give you the opportunity to leave us on a more positive note. Whether that is just what you're up to departmentally, or your vision for the public works, or whatever else you want to share with the listeners today.
Well, thanks, Bob. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think for us in public works, it's an exciting time. I think having a winter like this is always a good opportunity to kind of like go back and do the post-mortem on it and say, how did we truly do, and try to be subjective to what the performance was, and then kind of like start looking at, is there opportunities to improve the service level, make sure that we get the best bang for the buck budget-wise? Is there something we can do for the folks to make sure that we don't burn them out? How do we provide a better level of service to the taxpayers? So even though it was it was a challenging winter, for us it's exciting because it's a good opportunity to say, hey, you remember we saw some of this stuff in 2017, now it's 2022, so let's bite into that and let's make sure that we use it to the good, so the next time an event like this comes through, that we have some opportunities to improve the service, right? And we kind of like that continuous improvement is kind of like a new mindset. It is. We do want to provide a good level of service. We want to make sure that we stretch the dollar to the max. So we're looking at newer technologies. For example, in the summer, we've trialed a pothole detection system. So previously, we had an increased reliance on our citizens calling us and say, hey, there's a pothole at the intersection of X and Y. And now we basically have a detection system that basically at the end of the day spits out the report and say, these are the amount of potholes that I've noticed, and it automatically dispatches the crews. So there's a lot of innovation happening in public works. So I think the next 2 to 3 years are going to be a very, very exciting time, and I think we'll see an accelerated level of innovation in this particular space, because it's not an easy space to innovate in. And I think by tackling some of those challenges, we'll see some innovations that could potentially be very exciting.
Well, yeah, I agree. It's probably not an easy area to innovate in, and usually you're attracting attention when everybody's complaining. So you have obviously a bit of a challenging job. And Gert Bos, thank you. for coming and speaking with me today and the listeners today, and giving us a little bit more information on how you deal with challenges of your job, challenges of snowfall, and let's hope for a great spring.
Let's indeed hope for a fantastic spring. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Kelowna Talks. For more conversations about topics that matter in your community, subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you liked what you heard, give us a 5-star rating and share Kelowna Talks with your friends and neighbors. If you'd like more information about this podcast and other big community conversations, visit kelowna.ca/community stories.